Dan Perry is the former regional editor of Associated Press in the Middle East and author of Ask Questions Later, Substack newsletter. He's joining us from Tel Aviv. So thank you very much indeed for being with us. This ceasefire agreement was signed by both sides, and it was understood that all the processes had been put in place. What is the Netanyahu coalition trying to achieve by changing the goalposts and pushing for this extension at this point?
Well, look, the second phase of the agreement had not been finalized in terms of the details, the modalities, the exact procedures. In fact, only the first had been. But I would agree that the deal, if read in the way that is simplest, basically meant that at the end of all the stages, Israel gets back the hostages and pulls out of Gaza and ends the war, with the implication that it leaves Hamas in power. That implication is highly unpalatable to the Israeli public also, even though they do in the end support the deal. Definitely to the Israeli government and to the far-right allies of Netanyahu, who control the fate of his coalition and have threatened to bring him down if that deal goes through. Now, the change is that the U.S. president now basically has given Netanyahu what looks like a carte blanche to end the war, to end the ceasefire, and to resume the war, which would be unpopular in Israel, but which would salvage his coalition and which would address the problem of leaving Hamas in power in Gaza. Now, even though the deal does imply that is the short-term outcome, I can't pretend like I think that's good for the Palestinians even. So there is an issue here, and many people in Israel would argue, I would certainly argue, that while Hamas needs to be moved aside, it would be better to do so by diplomatic means post-war rather than resume the war with all that implies, which probably includes a sacrificing of the lives of the remaining hostages.
I want to ask you just about the coalition itself, the coalition of Benjamin Netanyahu. How much does the survival of that coalition and the survival of Benjamin Netanyahu as Prime Minister of Israel factor into the delays and the changes that we're seeing now?
Well, as I say, Netanyahu has what I believe is an obsession with staying in power. He has what I would call Louis XIV complex. I am the state. And he truly seems to believe to the depths of his soul that he is the savior of Israel, and almost any price is worth paying for him to remain at the helm. That view is very much not shared by the Israeli public. Even though, as I say, the public is unhappy, rightly unhappy, with any outcome that leaves Hamas in power permanently. 70% or more want to see this deal go through simply because they've decided, the public has, to prioritize the lives of the hostages. And also, they see very clearly that even though Gaza has been trashed and Hamas has been vastly weakened, largely because Israel itself has refused to engineer an alternative, largely the only possible one is a revamped and improved Palestinian Authority. To engineer a situation where they replace Hamas, even if Hamas did agree to step down, the military campaign isn't achieving the goal. Now, I think that goal should be one that the entire region, if not the entire world, wants. But the way the way I would go about it, basically, is to let Hamas celebrate on the ruins of Gaza for a few days and then make clear to the Palestinian people that their choice is a regional and global plan to revamp Gaza, to rebuild it with the tens of billions of dollars necessary. And the Arab world and the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Qataris helping the new Palestinian Authority, to holding their hand and helping them create good governance and maintain security if needed with boots on the ground as a model for doing the same thing in much of the West Bank. Or if Hamas refuses to step aside and accept exile for its leadership, let's say, maybe even immunity, then the result will be a continuation of the blockade by Israel and Egypt, very minimal humanitarian aid going in, and almost no hope. Now, the Palestinian people, the people of Gaza, are traumatized, and many of them radicalized, but they're not irrational. And given the choice between a real, concrete plan of hope going forward and continued misery under the rule of jihadi nihilists who have brought this destruction upon them, I have to think public opinion will eventually force Hamas's hand.
The deal that Israel is proposing, at least in terms of this extension, seems to be, and I am oversimplifying, but essentially give us everything. That's the deal. And given the fact that Hamas is inevitably going to push back against that, is there any room for negotiation at this stage? Can you see anything that Israel would be willing to compromise on in order to be able to move this forward?
I think you're not oversimplifying, but you're sidestepping the unstated issue, which is the problem. The Witkoff deal basically says Israel gets half the hostages now and half the hostages after Ramadan and Passover on April 9th, and then the war ends. But what's unstated is that Israel, between those two stages, will obviously demand Hamas step aside or resume the war. I believe that is likely to be what Netanyahu will do under pressure from his extreme right. And if they do that and Hamas refuses and the war resumes, then that would be extremely unfortunate for the Palestinian civilians who will die, for the hostages who will die, for the Israeli soldiers who will die. And it's needless because, as I say, there is a better way. But the main issue is, am I and other analysts correct in assuming that in that interregnum between now and the potential resumption of the war, Netanyahu will insist on Hamas agreeing to step aside as a condition for not resuming the war? I repeat, I wish for that outcome myself, as I think should people involved with good faith all over the world. But that was not in the original deal. That would, in fact, to insist on that, else return to the war, would be a change in the original deal. And I think if they're inclined to do that, the only force on earth that can prevent it is not Israeli public opinion, because Netanyahu does have his majority votes in the Knesset. But rather the leadership in Washington. And as for that leadership in Washington, we see that there has been something of a change. And they're unlikely to be people who sanctify already written agreements. Note that Trump, just in recent days, has tried to turn what was aid to Ukraine into loans to Ukraine to be repaid 3 times over through mineral wealth.
We appreciate it, as always, Daniel. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Dan Perry is the former regional editor of Associated Press in Middle East and author of Ask Questions Later Substack newsletter. He's joining us from Tel Aviv. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. What's your assessment of why the Netanyahu coalition is insisting on the extension of Phase 1 and refusing to move on to talks about Phase 2 in the ceasefire?
Well, Phase 2 was meant to basically finalize the details by which the agreement would be implemented to its logical conclusion, which includes where when Israel gets back the last hostage, it ends the war, pulls out, and Hamas remains in power in Gaza. My reading of this is that Israel never was comfortable with that. The government never was. The government is beholden to far-right parties that would probably bring it down if it went ahead and executed that. And so they're trying to get away, really, from ever reaching an agreement on the second phase as such, and continue instead the first phase, whereby they continue to get back some hostages and then the war doesn't resume. The major question is whether in the end some mode will be found to enable the deal to be finished, and somehow to get around this blockage whereby Netanyahu feels, I think correctly, that if he actually implements a deal as it was written, as he was sort of forced to do by Trump in mid January, his government will collapse. His government may, by the way, collapse for other reasons as well. But that is a major issue.
Since the beginning of this particular war, critics of Benjamin Netanyahu said that he made a fundamental error in essentially backing himself into a corner when he said that he had to eradicate Hamas, that he was going to remove Hamas completely in every particular form that it was currently in. Given the fact, what you're talking about in terms of trying to find a way forward in terms of these ceasefire talks, is there anything, any position do you think that Israel is able to take with regard to Hamas particularly in order to be able to move things forward?
Many people in Israel, and I think a majority of the public opinion in Israel, would have the government do the deal regardless of the political consequences, because the survival of Netanyahu is not a strategic imperative of the country. And I think the majority of Israelis want to prioritize the salvation of the hostages, and they're kind of tired of the war. They observe that over a year of this war hasn't removed Hamas from power in Gaza. It's caused tremendous damage to Hamas. It's weakened them, but they're still there. And there's an irony, because Hamas is still there partly because the government has refused any plan to replace them with anyone, because, again, the far right in the government, which prefers eternal occupation and indeed the settlement of Jews in Gaza, would have refused to countenance such a plan. So Israel's very much in a catch-22 situation where no matter where they go, some disaster looms. I think the only way forward, really, is for Israel to work with the world and the Arab League to create a an incentive on Hamas and pressure on Hamas to agree to step aside. And I've noticed that other speakers on your channel, indeed after I appeared last time, seem to feel that Hamas has agreed to this in a way. A government of technocrats that would govern in their stead, and they would sort of be in the shadows. If that were made clear, then that would certainly be a step forward. However, I doubt Israel would agree to have that be the new arrangement where Hamas retains its militia fully armed and in fact is the power behind this technocratic government. I think it needs Arab League and Arab world pressure to make Hamas truly stand aside. But I don't think there's much appetite for extending the war and doing that militarily. That promises more misery for all sides.
I want to bring you back to a point that you were alluding to in your first answer, in the standing of Benjamin Netanyahu as Prime Minister and his apparent determination to remain in power. Give us some context for viewers who perhaps are coming to this story for the first time. Where does that desire by Benjamin Netanyahu to remain in power play into what we are seeing on the ground in Gaza, but also, of course, with regard to the ceasefire talks?
Look, you could say everything is a negotiation and what's presented in public isn't what will ultimately happen. And of course, whenever Trump is involved, then that's very much part of the paradigm. However, in the case of Netanyahu, I think his history has shown that his number one priority is staying in power. It's not even a question of far right or left or center from the point of view of what he would like to have happen. His current government prevents him from doing certain things. It prevents him from organizing a plausible day after planning for Gaza if Hamas were to step aside. So I think Netanyahu right now, in the view of many people in Israel, is an impediment. And if he were truly a patriot, then he would probably put aside calculations that have to do with his political expediency. After all, he is currently the prime minister who served more time in that position in Israel than anyone in the country's history, including David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister. And it would be no great disaster if this government of his that brought mostly calamity to Israel in the 2 years and 2 months of its existence were indeed to be replaced. And as I suggested before, there are other issues that could cause its collapse, including the fact that they may be unable to pass a budget, which has to pass within a month. Largely because of the Haredi party's insistence on being given the right to permanent draft evasion at a time when the country is at war and running out of soldiers. And so they're not going to back the budget. And that would itself cause the government to collapse. So much more than may be visible from a distance, the government of Israel is between a rock and a hard place. And I think if it were replaced reasonably soon by a centrist government, that might open the way for a lot of solutions that today seem impossible. But I caution the Israelis' desire, any Israeli government's desire, to move Hamas aside from Gaza, disarm the group, and replace and bring instead a government that you could do business with and potentially move towards peace with. That desire is very, very strong. So I don't see a good future for the Middle East as long as Hamas remains armed and in control of the Gaza Strip.
It's really interesting to get your thoughts on this. Dan Perry, as always, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.